I'm Patrick Hiesl. I'm Assistant Professor of Forest Operations at Clemson University. I usually teach timber harvesting, forest operations, and wood procurement classes. Today I'm actually talking about what effect can you as a logging crew have on the monetary gain of landowners. So basically what I want to tell you about is some reasoning behind landowners coming up to you and being mad, or being out there on the harvest site and looking at what you're actually doing, and then tell you a little bit about how stand damage that you may cause or how merchandising can affect the bottom line of a landowner and how much money he can make or lose with that. Now let's talk a little bit about stand damage. When I look at stand damage, I basically categorize it into 4 different categories. Low damage levels, basically just a bark scuff. Low damage usually doesn't prohibit tree growth or anything. You don't lose any money with it, so usually we ignore that part. But then you have medium stand damage or medium tree damage where the bark is removed but you have no wood fibers exposed. So sometimes your turn trees look like that, all the bark is gone, you just have wood exposed. High damage is when the cambium is broken, you have wood fibers exposed, so maybe your fellow buncher nipped a little tree, you see the wood fibers coming out. And then you have severe damage where for whatever reason the tops actually broke. Maybe you cut a tree, the trees come down and then they break another top of another tree and then you have no crown left. So that's severe damage. All this damage, if you look at the slide that I have here, basically I'm showing you what the variation can be. So I looked in 5 different sites and kind of compared, how much stand damage there was after a commercial thinning. And it ranges anywhere from 10% stand damage to over 30% stand damage. And that damage is basically the number of trees damaged per acre that are left, the percent of the trees left. So we have that. And even if you take out the low damage levels, you're still ending up somewhere between 8 to 25%, so up to a quarter of your trees going to be damaged. And it differs from one logging crew to another logging crew and from one job to another job. Now, what does it mean in terms of the loss in value? So the next graph that you see here, the next slide here, shows you a simulated stand, a loblolly pine plantation, site index of 75, so something that you would see in the upstate of South Carolina. And then you see 4 different bars that represent 4 different damage levels. 5% of the trees damaged, 10, 15, and 20% of the trees damaged. And in terms of the revenue that has been lost because of the damage, when we assume that every damaged tree at the time of the second thinning ends up as a pulpwood. So in terms of percent, it's only between 1 and 6% that you would actually lose. That's the value. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you scale it up to a 50-acre harvest tract, it's somewhere between $3,000 that you would lose with a 5% damage up to $12,000, $13,000 when you have 20% of the trees damaged. So for a landowner, that's a lot of money. You have $3,000, you have $20,000, or you lose it. So that's one of those things. All right, so what is an acceptable level of stand damage? We all know that whenever you do a harvesting operation, there's going to be stand damage. There's just no way to avoid it completely. But I think what we can agree on that it should be as low as possible. And talking to a lot of foresters and landowners, and what has been seen out here is that a 5%, so 5% of the standing trees left after thinning, if that's the number that's damaged, that's acceptable. Maybe up to 10%, but the smaller the better. So let's agree that we can work with a 5% stand damage. That's just what your top logger, that's the best that you can do. Now, how much damage can you actually sustain and how much does it cost you? Or how much money would a landowner lose with certain levels of stand damage? Now we said 5% stand damage, that's normal, that's your baseline, everybody will do that. But let's say your landowner has the choice between choosing somebody that can create 5% stand damage or somebody that maybe creates 15% or 20% damage. what would be the difference in stumpage that the landowner would have to receive to actually break even. And with stand damage levels of more than 15%, the landowner basically would need $4 more per ton for every product coming off of the land to actually break even. If you look into 30% damage, you would need more than $6 or $7 per ton extra to break even. So that just shows you that every percent of damage, every tree that's damaged, can have a huge impact on the landowner's bottom line. And basically it's about $3,000 on a 50-acre tract for every 5% of damage that you cause. So maybe what's important to say here is that if a landowner comes out to a harvest site, take the time to talk to them. Explain to them in 5 minutes why this tree is all messed up, why you have a bunch of these trees all skinned up, and why it's important for you to have them so you can prevent other trees from being damaged. And then, just also let them know that at the end of the harvest, you will remove those trees. They will end up in the product piles, the landowner will actually get money for it, and everything will be fine at the end of the harvest. So we have talked about stand damage and how that can affect the bottom line of the landowner, and how little damage can have huge effects, and a huge impact on the bottom line of a landowner. Now let's talk about merchandising and how merchandising individual trees and the total stand can affect, however, how much money a landowner can make. Now with merchandising, we know, and I'll show you in a minute here, that improper merchandising can affect your bottom line significantly. Now merchandising is a skill, and I don't need to tell you that, you all know that it's a skill and it needs to be learned and trained. You don't just jump into like the loader and start cutting and merchandising perfectly. You learn it, you get trained, you learn basically through your mistakes. Now if you look into the slide that you see here, I looked into the value of one tree. Let's say we have a 40-foot pine and we'll get 24 feet of pulpwood out of it and a 16-foot chip and saw log. We can discuss all day long whether or not, in your specific region, these specs would work, but let's take it as an example and see what happens with that. If I take the stumpage values that I have that are from Timbermart South, these are South Carolina statewide averages, they're fairly high. They're like $12.44 for pulpwood, $18.94 for chip and saw. But looking into the length of the wood and the weight of the wood, that one tree, 40-foot length, is worth about $9.05. Now what happens if we say we don't cut out that chip and saw log and we just merchandise for one product? We throw that whole 40-foot into our pulpwood pile. Well, if we do that, that value of the tree is reduced to $6.97. So that's about a $2 difference on one single tree. Now we all know when you do timber harvesting on a per acre basis, you're not cutting one tree, right? You're cutting multiple trees. Let's say we do a thinning and we cut 150 of those trees per acre. If you look into the numbers on that presentation slide here, 150 trees fully merchandised, that's about $1,400 per acre in stumpage. If you don't merchandise those trees, if you say, I don't cut out that chip and saw, I just put everything into pulpwood, you end up with about $1,000 per acre. So there's like over $300 in difference per acre, and if you would scale it up to a 50-acre tract, you're basically losing the landowner $15,600, just like that. If you look into a percentage value of the total stand there on 50 acres, those $15,600 that we just lost, that's about 23% of the total value of the stand. So that's a quarter of what the landowner could have made. That's just lost because we didn't merchandise, we didn't take that extra time to take that chip and saw log out of the total tree. Now, what are some other ways to do some improper merchandising? Sometimes, maybe you put saw logs in the chip and saw pile or in the pulpwood pile. I'm not saying that you do that, but it may happen, and if you don't know that merchandising can have such a huge impact on the bottom line for the landowner, it may happen that you don't pay too close attention. It may happen that your logs move into the wrong pile. Maybe your operator, has a bad day, he's not paying attention, and it just moves into the wrong pile. That can cost a lot of money to the landowner. Another way to do improper merchandising would be wasting product by merchandising for a high valued product instead of merchandising the whole tree. Like at the beginning I said, maybe you have the best interest of the landowner in mind and you want to merchandise for the highest valuable product. You say, alright, I can do pulpwood or I can do chip and saw, or maybe I do a combination of both. But if you as a logger or the operator, you're in the equipment, you say, you know what, chip and saw is worth more money than pulpwood. So I want to try to maximize the amount of chip and saw I get out of one single tree. And maybe I have this 40-foot tree that we just talked about, and instead of getting 24 feet of pulpwood out of it and only one 16-foot log of chip and saw, maybe there's a way to get out a 32-foot log of chip and saw and then end up with, about an 8-foot piece that would be pulpwood, but we all know nobody will take that 8-foot log, so we just leave it in the woods. We'll just bring it back in, we're not using it, we're not merchandising. But in our minds, we did the landowner a favor, right? Because we merchandised for the highest value product that is out there. That would be chip and saw. Now, if you look into the slide that I have here on the screen now, if I fully merchandise for pulpwood and chip and saw, the tree value is about $8.37. If we only merchandise for chip and saw with that 32-foot log of chip and saw, we now have a tree value of $7.98. Now that's only a 40-cent difference. Maybe not as bad, but let's scale it up to 150 trees per acre. Then we're ending up with about a difference of $60 per acre. So those 40 cents, they don't sound a lot for one individual tree, but once you look on a per acre basis, the number is getting larger. $60 per acre, that's a 5% loss of the total value. Now the best way to avoid any issues, in my mind, is communication. Communicate to the landowner what you're doing, why you're doing. If a landowner comes out, he shows that he's interested. If you never see a landowner on your harvest site, he's probably not too worried about that. He may be not educated enough and doesn't want to know about it. But if a landowner comes out, take those 5 minutes, tell him what you're doing, maybe show him what you're doing and how you're merchandising and why you're doing what you're doing. And those 5 minutes, they may help you, prevent a lot of trouble later in the long run. Because the landowner understands what you're doing and doesn't think that you don't have his best interest in mind. Now, who's going to check what you are doing on any given harvest site? Will it be the landowner or will it be the forester? Who should actually be doing that work? Now let's think about it, the landowner. Landowners in South Carolina, they have different levels of education in terms of forestry. Some of them are very engaged in forest management and forestry training. They take all kinds of workshops and they probably know a lot and they can talk to you on the right level and understand what you're telling them, and they may see something out there that they think is not right. But in general, the landowner usually doesn't have a 4-year degree, doesn't have the education that a forester would have, may doesn't know what is going on in terms of laws and regulations and everything else. So what the landowner should do when he sees something should basically notify his consulting forester if he uses one. They can talk to you as a logger, get some more information, and that's the communication part that I was stressing early on. But in general, they should notify the forester, and then the forester should come out and see what's going on. In my personal opinion, I believe that a forester, when he's hired by a landowner, should be out there when you start up your logging operation, should make sure in the first few days that you're actually cutting to the prescription that the forester has laid out, that the forester wants to see on the ground. And if there's anything that needs to be adjusted or changed, it should happen in the first 2 or 3 days. The forester shouldn't let you on the property and then disappear for a week. That's not how it works, because if you do something that wasn't exactly the way that the forester had in mind, in 1 week you can cut a lot of timber. You can damage a stand significantly, cut more trees than necessary, and then create some long-term issues for the landowner. You may not see them, but the landowner and the forester will have to deal them for the next 20 or 30 years after you cut the timber. Because remember, you are providing a service to the landowner as much as the landowner is hiring you and providing a service to you to keep you in business. So it's this mutual agreement. So if you can't work well with each other, don't be surprised if one of you needs to leave. The last piece I want to talk to you about is, who do landowners in South Carolina contract their logging job to? A year and a half ago, I have done a little survey among landowners in South Carolina and asked them, how do you choose the logging contractor that's working on your property? And I gave them 4 options. Do you do your own research? Look them up, ask other people about how that logging crew is doing. You use somebody that you used previously? Do you go with the recommendation from a consulting forester? Or do you go just with whoever is associated with your highest bid when you do a timber bid? Now what came back is that we have basically 2 groups of landowners in South Carolina. We have the ones that use a consulting forester to do the forest management for them, and we have landowners that don't use a consulting forester. They basically manage the timber their own. They do everything themselves. Now if you look at the slide that I have up here, it shows you that the group that uses a consulting forester, about 60% of them use a logging crew that has been recommended to them by their consulting forester. This is important to know. This means that if you have the reputation of being a good logger that respects the land, does a job well, you don't cause too much stand damage, and you're reasonable with whatever you do, well then you get recommended to other loggers. So word of mouth gets out, and you may end up with another logging job and another logging job because you have a very good reputation. It's only about 30% of the landowners that actually go with a logging contractor that's associated with the highest bid. But landowners that do their own forest management, they don't use a forester, those are those brown bars in that screen here, about half of them do their own research or use a logger that they used previously. That's the reputation part. If you have a good reputation, they ask their neighbor, they ask their friends, they maybe ask a forester. Your name comes up and you may get invited to cut that piece of timber on their property. About 30% of them go with the recommendation that they have either from a forester or from a friend, and only about 20% go with the logging crew that's associated with the highest bid. So there's this big difference between landowners that use a forester, that rely heavily on recommendations, and landowners that manage their own timber. But at the end it all comes down, if you do a good job, you're honest, you get a good reputation, you will for sure end up with another logging job, and you may even go back on the same property or with the same landowner on their land base. Why do you as a logger need to know about this information that I just shown you? Why do you need to know about how much money it can cost to a landowner having all different stand damage, having issues with merchandising? I want you to understand that you are in the position to make a lot of money for the landowner or lose a lot of money for the landowner. Stand damage can happen any day. It happens in a hurry. A tree falls down and you have a little bit of an opening, you have a wound in a tree. It doesn't even look like a lot. And it doesn't cause an immediate effect. It causes an effect 7 years from now, 10 years from now, when you're long gone. There will be rot in the tree is no longer a saw log, maybe it ends up in pulpwood, so you're losing a lot of money. Maybe with merchandising, you have the best interest for the landowner in mind, and maybe that's what you do. You always try to merchandise for the highest valuable product. But maybe that's not the best way to use a tree. Now I want you to think about this and to understand it, what position you're in and what you can do and cannot do, and how whatever small it is you do or you think it may be can have effects on the landowner and the bottom line and the money that landowner will make in the future. Loggers are true professionals. I think I can appreciate that. I teach forest operations to my students in class. I teach it to landowners. I visited a lot of harvest sites here in South Carolina. I brought my students out to harvest sites. And I can really say, and I ran some of the equipment myself just for 5 minutes, but I have a total appreciation for what you guys do day in, day out in your logging equipment, getting timber to the landing, process it, and getting on a truck. So I just said you're all true professionals, and I want you to know that within the broader forest industry, loggers are valued. We as foresters, mills, landowners, we may not show it every day, but you are appreciated and you are a very necessary and a very welcome unit of the wood supply chain. If we wouldn't have you, nothing would happen in terms of forest management. Timber wouldn't be growing as well as it's growing now. Mills wouldn't be producing what they're producing now. We wouldn't have the paper. We would have limited supply of saw logs and boards. Houses couldn't be built. So you are a very important part. You're very much appreciated. And I want you to know that and end my presentation with this.